The palace gates had never been so quiet, and yet, the silence itself seemed to speak louder than any official announcement. If you are following these unprecedented royal developments, make sure to subscribe to this channel so you never miss the next turn in this historic moment. In a single breathtaking address, a legacy long tied to a beloved memory has been reignited, reshaping the foundation of an institution that once seemed unshakable. What began as a scandal has evolved into a monumental reckoning, one that now places the spotlight on William and Catherine as they step into a role that feels both inevitable and deeply symbolic. The events unfolding in real time are not just about a title being set aside or a speech being made, but about a legacy being rewritten before the eyes of millions. When the king appeared before the nation earlier today, his expression carried the weight of both duty and loss. His words were careful, but they were also unmistakably final. He confirmed what had been whispered for weeks, that Camilla would quietly withdraw from public life. It was a sentence that seemed simple on paper, but its ripples were immense. For those who remember the story that began decades ago with Diana, it felt like a page had turned in a book the world thought was already written. Her memory, long a quiet undercurrent in royal affairs, had surged to the surface with extraordinary force, shaping not only the public response but the monarchy's direction. As the speech was broadcast across television screens, phones, and public squares, thousands began gathering outside the palace gates. Some came with flowers, some with handwritten letters, and many carried small replicas of a single item that had become the emotional anchor of the moment, a sapphire brooch. It was more than a piece of jewelry. It was a symbol. To many, it represented the grace and dignity associated with Diana, and its sudden reappearance had lit a spark that turned private memory into public movement. People of all ages stood in quiet vigil, their faces reflecting not anger, but a collective sense of gravity. Something important was shifting, and they knew it. The king's voice faltered briefly as he spoke of responsibility, legacy, and the enduring strength of the crown. There was no denial of the pain surrounding the scandal, no attempt to disguise the fact that the family stood at a crossroads. Instead, he leaned into the language of accountability, acknowledging the storm rather than pretending it did not exist. In doing so, he effectively opened the door to something that had not been seen in generations, a monarchy that could visibly bend without breaking. It was as if the institution itself had decided to breathe. For those watching, the most powerful moment came not from what the king said, but from what followed. William and Catherine, standing silently behind him, did not need to speak to command attention. Their presence alone carried the weight of transition. In that stillness, many saw what they believed to be the shape of the future. It was not a loud takeover, nor a sudden declaration. It was quiet assurance. It was the promise of continuity wrapped in a new kind of grace, one that felt different from the past but still tethered to it in a way that honored the legacy of Diana. The symbolism was impossible to ignore. At the close of his address, the king entrusted the historic Queen Mary's crown to Catherine, instructing that it be held in safekeeping. The gesture was deliberate and heavy with meaning. It was not a coronation, nor a formal handover, but it was something else entirely. It was an unspoken message that the public read instantly. It said that this chapter would not end in scandal alone, but in renewal. It said that while the present may be complicated, the future was already being written in careful, steady lines. The media reaction was immediate and global. Headlines framed the moment as a quiet but undeniable turning point. Commentators spoke less of scandal and more of symbolism. Analysts described the act as one of the most significant cultural shifts in recent royal history, not because of any legal change or official decree, but because the emotional weight of Diana's legacy had once again shaped the story. And unlike in the past, this time it was embraced rather than avoided. It was as if her memory, once treated as a complicated shadow, had become the guiding light of a new narrative. In the crowd outside, people whispered her name, not in mourning but in recognition. It had been years since she walked among them. Yet her presence felt tangible, alive in every blue stone, in every petal laid at the gate. The public was not just reacting to an announcement, They were participating in the rewriting of a story that had defined a generation. For many, it felt like a long overdue moment of clarity. The weight of the past had finally been acknowledged, not hidden. And in that acknowledgement, something powerful took root. The palace had seen waves of public reaction before, but this one felt different. It was not just a crowd. It was a collective memory gathering in real time. The brooch, the flowers, the quiet chants of her name, all of it created a scene that felt less like protest and more like a reckoning. It was not anger that filled the air. It was something far deeper. It was the sound of history settling into place, of a nation realizing it was watching a legacy pass from one era to another. What comes next is not yet written, but the tone has already been set. In that courtyard, beneath the stone walls that have witnessed centuries of power and transition, William and Catherine did not have to speak. Their presence was enough. The people understood what it meant. This moment would not be remembered for the scandal that forced it into motion, but for the quiet, historic way in which a legacy, long cherished and long mourned, found its way back into the center of the story.
The hours after the king's address unfolded like a carefully choreographed but entirely unscripted play. The palace balcony remained closed, but the emotional stage had already been set far beyond the royal walls. Outside, the crowd swelled. The air was cool and still, the kind of evening that made every whispered conversation seem louder. It was not simply about a speech or a symbolic gesture. It was about something deeper that had been simmering for years, perhaps decades, suddenly breaking the surface. People spoke softly about the past, but they looked toward William and Catherine with an intensity that revealed what they truly believed, that this moment marked the beginning of a new era. Within the palace, a quiet shift was taking place. Senior aides moved briskly through hallways, their faces solemn but purposeful. Every detail mattered now. Every step taken or not taken would be interpreted, replayed, magnified. William and Catherine were not merely appearing in the background anymore. Their role had grown larger without a single word being spoken. It was the weight of expectation settling on their shoulders in real time. Those who watched closely understood it was not a ceremonial silence. It was the calm presence of two figures who had been preparing, consciously or not, for a moment just like this. Meanwhile, in homes across the nation, families gathered around televisions, their faces lit by the pale glow of the broadcast. Social media feeds were flooded with old photographs, stories, and emotional tributes to Diana. Images of her wearing that sapphire brooch decades ago circulated widely, paired with clips of the king's speech and Catherine standing quietly behind him. The contrast between the past and present was striking, but it was not jarring. It felt to many like a natural progression, a full circle moment. The memory of Diana, once a delicate subject, was now a unifying symbol. Her story was no longer a separate thread. It had become part of the fabric of this unfolding chapter. In the crowd outside, there were young people who had only ever known Diana through old footage, documentaries, and the stories their parents told them. Yet they stood shoulder to shoulder with older generations who had watched the original fairy tale unfold and then fracture in real time. This merging of generations created something rare. It was not merely nostalgia. It was a collective understanding that her legacy had transcended time. Even those who had not lived through the past felt the weight of it, as if it belonged to everyone. As the night deepened, journalists spoke to people gathered at the palace gates. One woman, clutching a brooch replica close to her chest, explained that she was not there to celebrate or to protest. She was there to bear witness. Another man, older, said softly that he had stood in the same spot many years ago when flowers filled the street after Diana's passing. He had returned because he felt in his words like history was giving her the dignity she deserved. The crowd was not restless. It was reflective. The hush that lingered between conversations carried more meaning than the words themselves. Inside, William and Catherine remained out of public view, but their absence did not lessen their presence. In fact, it made it stronger. The public did not need to hear from them yet. Their silence, calm and steady, spoke volumes. It was a deliberate kind of grace. By not rushing to the microphone, they allowed the emotional weight of the king's address and the symbolism of the moment to settle. It created a sense of continuity, rather than disruption. For many, it was this quiet restraint that made them appear ready for what was to come. Observers and commentators began to draw parallels between what was happening now and the seismic shift that followed Diana's death. But this was not a mirror image of the past. It was something new. Back then, the institution had struggled to keep up with public sentiment. Now, it was acknowledging it in real time. It was allowing the public to shape the narrative rather than trying to control it entirely. This shift in tone was subtle but unmistakable, and it gave people a sense that the royal family was learning, changing. Evolving global headlines began to frame the night as more than a scandal. They described it as a cultural and emotional turning point. Images of Catherine holding the crown for safekeeping were shared across every major outlet, described as elegant, symbolic, and quietly historic. Analysts called it a moment of soft transfer, not in legal terms but in emotional resonance. It was a way of signaling without declaring, of preparing without forcing. And it worked. The public responded with an unusual mix of trust and patience, something rarely seen in moments of upheaval. For those who remember the chaos that followed Diana's passing, this night felt different. It was not filled with shouting crowds or angry banners. It was quieter, more deliberate. People were not demanding change with raised fists. They were standing in quiet understanding, sensing that change was already underway. It was not a revolution. It was a rewriting. It was the steady handover of emotional loyalty from one chapter to the next, carried not by dramatic gestures, but by symbols, memory, and shared history. And in that calm, something remarkable happened. The monarchy, which had often been accused of being detached or unfeeling in times of crisis, began to reflect the emotions of the people without a single official statement beyond the king's. The silence was not cold. It was intentional. It was the space in which the nation could remember Diana, acknowledge the scandal, and look toward William and Catherine with both caution and hope. It was a rare alignment of legacy, accountability, and the quiet promise of the future. Morning came slowly, pale light slipping over the palace walls and filtering through the thinning fog that had lingered overnight. The flowers laid outside the gates were now piled higher than anyone could have anticipated, a living monument to memory and emotion. Overnight, thousands more people had arrived, some in silence, some whispering prayers, others simply standing with their heads bowed. What began as a ripple had turned into a tide. It was not just about the present announcement. It was about everything that had led to this point, about years of unspoken feelings and unfinished stories now resurfacing all at once. This was not just another royal headline. This was a rewriting of an emotional history that had stretched across generations. Television crews, photographers, and journalists lined the edges of the crowd, careful not to disturb the quiet rhythm of the scene. They knew they were capturing something that would be replayed for decades to come. The soundscape was gentle, just the soft shuffling of feet and the occasional low murmur. No chants, no banners, only shared presence. What made this gathering unique was that it did not feel organized, and yet it felt unified. People from different places and ages were standing together with an understanding that did not need words. The memory of Diana had become a shared language. William and Catherine appeared at the palace steps just after dawn. Their presence alone drew a stillness over the crowd, as if someone had pressed pause on the entire scene. Catherine wore a simple dark coat, her hair pinned neatly back, while William stood close beside her, their movements deliberate but unforced. They did not wave, they did not speak, and yet the crowd reacted with reverence, stepping slightly closer but never crossing the barriers. In that moment, the symbolism was crystal clear. They were not above the people, they were with them. They were not just figures of royalty, they were figures of continuity. As they approached the rows of flowers, Catherine leaned down to place a single white rose at the base of the growing memorial. It was a gesture that said everything without uttering a word. The rose, simple and unadorned, echoed the countless white roses placed outside the palace decades earlier. It was a direct bridge between past and present. The crowd responded with silence so complete that it almost felt like the entire city was holding its breath. William bowed his head briefly, and that single gesture sent a wave of quiet emotion through those gathered. This moment was not carefully scripted. It felt raw and real. The couple stayed for several minutes, walking slowly along the gates, their eyes lingering on handwritten notes and small brooch replicas tucked among the flowers. Many of these brooches were made by hand, some elegant, some simple, all meant to honor the woman whose memory had outlived even the fiercest scandals. It was remarkable how one object, once just a piece of jewelry, had come to carry so much meaning. It represented more than Diana's style. It carried the weight of how she made people feel, how she connected with them in a way that transcended formalities. Around the world, news outlets broadcast these quiet gestures live. In living rooms, cafes, and crowded city squares, people watched as William and Catherine moved through the memorial like two figures stepping carefully through history. Analysts described the moment as the softest, yet most powerful assertion of leadership they had ever seen. There were no speeches, there was no dramatic declaration, yet everyone watching seemed to understand what was being communicated. It was a statement of presence, not power. Within hours, public sentiment began to shift even more visibly. Polls, comment sections, and global coverage reflected a growing feeling that this couple, standing in quiet solidarity with the public, embodied something larger than any scandal could overshadow. The crown that Catherine had been entrusted to hold the previous day had already become a symbol, not of grandeur, but of responsibility. People began speaking less of titles and more of stewardship. It was as if the narrative had taken on a life of its own, moving beyond the initial shock and into something steady and enduring. Back at the gates, parents held their children close, explaining why people were leaving flowers. Young adults shared old photographs of Diana on their phones with friends who had never experienced her lifetime firsthand. The crowd was no longer merely reacting to a scandal. It was actively participating in shaping how this moment would be remembered. The energy was not chaotic. It was solemn, reverent, but also quietly hopeful. People did not need to be told to behave a certain way. They simply knew that this was history, and they treated it with the weight it deserved. Inside the palace, the atmosphere reflected the shift outside. What had begun as an emergency response to scandal had evolved into something else entirely. Senior figures spoke quietly, acknowledging that the public had found its own way of responding, one that had little to do with official statements. It was the emotional current of the nation that was now steering the conversation, and the palace, for once, was allowing itself to follow rather than lead. This reversal of roles was subtle but profound. William and Catherine returned inside after their quiet vigil, but their presence lingered. The crowd remained long after they disappeared from view. People continued placing flowers, lighting candles, and tucking small notes beneath the iron gates. Some of those notes carried messages like, "You were never forgotten," or "This is your legacy." They were addressed to Diana, but they were also acknowledgements of what was happening now. It was as if the people were writing directly to the past to give it a new future. What made this scene unlike so many others in the monarchy's long history was the absence of spectacle. There were no trumpets, no formal processions, no staged performances. It was the simplicity that gave it its weight. One white rose, a bowed head, a brooch tucked among flowers. These were not grand gestures, but they carried more meaning than 1,000 speeches could. This was how history was being rewritten, not through decree, but through shared human emotion. It was subtle but unmistakable, and it was resonating far beyond the palace walls. By midday, the soft light of the early morning had shifted into something brighter, more defined, casting a pale golden hue over the palace grounds. The flowers outside the gates were no longer a collection of tributes, but a living ocean of white and blue. The white roses represented memory. The blue brooch replicas represented legacy. Together, they formed a visual language more eloquent than any royal statement could have ever been. Crowds stretched farther than the eye could see, yet the atmosphere remained calm and unified. It was clear to everyone, whether they were standing on the cobblestones outside or watching through a screen miles away, that this was not just a public reaction. It was a collective rewriting of history. Inside the palace, the weight of the previous night's announcement still lingered, but it had transformed. It was no longer a storm pressing inward. It was a wind pushing everything forward. The king had retreated into private meetings with advisors, navigating the delicate space between tradition and transition. This was a moment where even silence carried meaning, and every action would echo for years to come. It was not lost on anyone that the emotional current had moved decisively toward William and Catherine. The public had chosen its figures of stability, and they had done so without any official declarations or formal ceremonies. Around the world, images of Catherine holding the historic crown the previous night were plastered across the front pages of international newspapers. Analysts called it a symbolic passing of the torch, even if nothing official had yet occurred. Commentators remarked on the careful restraint shown by the family. Rather than pushing against the wave of emotion, they had allowed it to unfold naturally. That strategy, intentional or not, had created something that rarely happens in such moments, a sense of alignment between institution and public feeling. The scandal that had once dominated the headlines now felt like a catalyst rather than the story itself. Meanwhile, as the crowds grew, personal stories began to emerge. Journalists interviewed people who had traveled overnight to be present, some carrying faded photographs of Diana from the 1980s and 1990s. Others had brooches passed down from their mothers or grandmothers, not because they were valuable, but because they were reminders of a time when Diana represented something bigger than royalty. She represented a kind of honesty, a kind of emotional accessibility that had rarely been seen within the palace walls. That legacy had never truly disappeared. It had been waiting beneath the surface, ready to resurface at the first crack in the old facade. One woman, standing near the gates with her teenage daughter, explained through tears that she had been a young girl herself when she watched Diana step into the public eye. She described how, even then, Diana had felt like someone who belonged to the people. Her daughter, who had never lived in the world where Diana was alive, listened quietly, holding a single blue brooch in her palm. It was moments like this that revealed the depth of what was unfolding. This was no longer just about the present royal family. This was about the way memory crosses generations, shaping how people see the world and how they choose to believe in it. Inside, senior figures within the palace watched the live coverage closely. They saw the same thing the public saw, William and Catherine becoming the emotional focal point of the nation. They were no longer just figures waiting in the wings. They were, without a single announcement, stepping into a symbolic leadership role that no press release could replicate. Their restraint, their quiet presence, and their willingness to let the moment belong to the people had created something powerful. It was trust. It was not built on official titles, but on shared emotion. The decision to keep Catherine holding Queen Mary's crown for safekeeping had been simple but strategic. It allowed the public to see continuity without demanding it. It spoke of future stability without the bluntness of official declarations. When the king had handed it to her, it was not just a transfer of an object. It was a message about faith in the future, about acknowledging the direction the tide was moving. That single image had become more defining than any speech could have been. In it, people saw not only a future queen, but the embodiment of a promise that Diana's memory would not fade quietly into history. At the same time, the global reaction was growing louder and more defined. International networks described the event as a royal reckoning, a symbolic turning point. Headlines praised William and Catherine as the calm in a storm, highlighting how they had stood quietly behind the king when he confirmed Camilla's withdrawal. This moment, they said, was different because it carried an undercurrent of both sorrow and resolve. It was an acknowledgement of past pain, but also a clear acceptance that the future was arriving whether the institution was ready or not. Among the most powerful moments came when Catherine was photographed standing near the gates early that morning, just after laying the white rose. The image circulated widely, often placed side by side with photographs of Diana in similar settings decades earlier. The resemblance was striking, not because of physical features but because of the emotional tone. It was quiet strength. It was elegance without distance. It was the kind of presence that makes people feel seen, not ruled. This, more than any speech, was why the public rallied so firmly behind her and William. In that context, Camilla's absence became its own silent chapter. She had retreated to her private residence, away from public appearances, away from cameras. There were no statements, no interviews, no attempts to redirect the narrative. Her absence said everything that needed to be said. The contrast between her retreat and the quiet strength of William and Catherine was stark, and the public noticed. The monarchy had faced crises before, but rarely had the emotional allegiances of the people been so visibly redrawn in such a short span of time. By afternoon, commentators were already using the language of legacy rather than scandal. This was not about blame anymore. It was about inheritance, memory, and transformation. What had started with an investigation and a withdrawal had evolved into something that reached far deeper than protocol. It had become a reckoning with history, with memory, and with the woman whose presence still lingered over everything, not as a ghost but as a guidepost. Diana was not being erased from the narrative. She was being centered in it. The institution itself had not officially changed. There had been no formal announcements beyond the king's address. Yet everyone could feel that something fundamental had shifted. It was not written in law, but it was etched into public sentiment. A chapter had quietly closed, and another was already being written in the language of flowers, silence, and collective memory. William and Catherine had not sought the moment, but it had found them, and in their stillness they had allowed it to bloom. This was how legacies become living things, not through force, but through quiet, undeniable resonance. As evening settled in, the palace courtyard was bathed in a soft amber glow, the kind that blurs the edges of time and memory. What had begun as a single address the night before had grown into a wave that now stretched far beyond the gates. The flowers, the brooches, and the countless quiet faces pressed against the barriers had turned the palace into something it rarely became, not a fortress, but a mirror. Everything reflected back the collective feeling of the people. The past, long buried beneath layers of protocol and silence, had risen to the surface and was shaping the future in real time. Inside, the atmosphere was noticeably different from the tense, uncertain hours that followed the initial announcement. There was still weight in the air, but it no longer felt like a storm pressing down. It felt like a tide, steady and inevitable, reshaping the coastline one wave at a time. Senior advisors moved with quieter voices. Every step, every whispered exchange, was underscored by the understanding that something irreversible had begun. It was not chaos, but it was change, and everyone inside those walls could feel it. The king spent much of the day in private reflection, away from cameras and statements. Those close to him understood the duality of his position. This was not just a royal decision to manage, it was also a deeply personal reckoning. The scandal that had brought everything to this point had cut through the walls of ceremony and landed in the fragile space where personal history meets public duty. He had carried the burden of both crown and heart for years, but this was different. This was the moment when the weight of the past, particularly Diana's legacy, no longer sat in the shadows. It had stepped into the center of the story. This reckoning had a peculiar shape. It was not loud, nor was it fiery. It was quiet, reflective, and public all at once. The king, once seen as the immovable center of the institution, now found himself in a position where the future was being defined around him, not by him. That was the power of legacy, especially one as potent as Diana's. It was the kind of legacy that outlived time, outlasted scandal, and reached into the present with an undeniable grip. No official decision could override it. No statement could dilute it. It was living memory, and living memory has a way of guiding a story even when no one intends it to. Throughout the day, analysts and historians filled the airwaves with measured words, describing this moment as the most symbolic turning point since Diana's passing. They spoke of how the monarchy had faced structural crises before, but rarely had it faced something so deeply rooted in collective feeling. This was not a policy matter. This was not a matter of law. This was about the emotional architecture of the nation itself. It was about trust, perception, and the stories people choose to carry forward. And at the center of that architecture stood William and Catherine, not as distant figures, but as living symbols of both continuity and change. The couple's quiet vigil that morning had already made its way into history books before the ink was dry. The photograph of Catherine laying a single white rose beneath the iron gates had circled the globe, finding its place on front pages, magazine covers, and digital feeds. It was not the grand gestures of the institution that defined this moment. It was this small, personal act. The world understood it instantly. It was not performative, it was deeply human. And that humanity was exactly what the public had been yearning for. At the same time, Camilla's absence continued to shape the narrative without a single word from her. She remained at Raymel House, far from the palace, away from the eyes of the world. There were no photographs, no sightings, only silence. And in that silence, the contrast grew sharper. On one side there was withdrawal, on the other, quiet presence. It became clear where the emotional center of gravity now rested. Public conversation shifted entirely away from her role and focused almost entirely on William, Catherine, and the memory of Diana. The story had moved on, and it was not waiting for anyone to catch up. In the crowd outside, the people continued their vigil as night fell. Candles were now scattered among the flowers, their flickering light reflecting softly off the metal gates. Someone played a quiet melody on a violin, and the sound floated through the still air. It was not a performance, but it was a sound that carried memory with it. Strangers stood side by side, some holding photographs, some just watching in silence. It was the kind of communal stillness that only happens in moments that everyone knows they will remember for the rest of their lives. The king's closest circle began quietly acknowledging what many outside had already accepted. This was no longer about damage control. This was about allowing the emotional truth of the moment to shape the institution rather than resisting it. Every attempt to steer the narrative away from Diana's legacy would only make it stronger. Instead, they understood that this was the time to honor it, to embrace it, to let it breathe through William and Catherine in a way that felt natural rather than forced. This was not a strategy. It was a surrender to something bigger than strategy. By late evening, commentators had begun calling it a soft handover of legacy. It was not a coronation, it was not a ceremony, but it carried more weight than either of those could have. The king was still the king, but the people were already seeing the future in the figures standing at the gates that morning. Catherine's calm grace and William's steady presence had done what no announcement could do. They had captured the trust of the people, not through pageantry, but through something far more powerful, quiet assurance. The palace itself seemed to reflect this shift. For years it had been a backdrop to spectacle, standing still while history played out around it. But on this night, it felt different. It felt like a living part of the moment, absorbing the weight of memory and emotion pouring in from outside. Every petal, every brooch, every candlelight flicker had woven itself into the walls. And inside those walls, those who held power knew that the story had already moved ahead of them. The people had spoken without shouting. The legacy of Diana had not just returned. It had become the foundation of what came next. This was the kind of moment that would not be marked by a single date in the history books, but by a collective feeling. People would remember where they were when they watched Catherine place that rose. They would remember how the air felt outside the gates. They would remember the sound of silence. They would remember how an old legacy reached into the present and rewrote the future without anyone needing to declare it. That was the power of this night. That was the power of legacy when it refuses to be forgotten. The following morning, the palace stood beneath a soft, silver light, the kind that makes everything feel both fragile and timeless. The crowd outside had not dispersed. In fact, it had grown. Rows of flowers now spilled out into the surrounding streets, creating paths of white and blue that stretched far beyond the gates. People moved quietly through them, not like tourists but like witnesses to something historic. The scent of roses lingered in the air. Candle wax stained the cobblestones. Handwritten notes fluttered lightly in the breeze. What had begun as a reaction to a single announcement had transformed into a national moment of reflection. And that reflection had a single, unmistakable focal point: legacy. This was not just a story about scandal anymore. It had moved past that. It had grown into something deeper, something with roots that reached back decades. It was about the way Diana's presence had lingered in the hearts of the people, waiting for a moment to step back into the light. It was about the way William and Catherine had, without speeches or declarations, allowed that presence to guide the narrative rather than resist it. It was about a monarchy that had once tried to control the story, now learning that the story had always belonged to the people. Throughout the morning, cameras captured a steady stream of quiet gestures. A young woman knelt down to place a necklace beside the flowers, explaining to a nearby journalist that it had belonged to her mother, who had admired Diana for her warmth. An older man, standing near the gates with a weathered face and trembling hands, whispered that he had never expected to live long enough to see this kind of reckoning. There were no slogans, no speeches, no demands. It was all emotion. It was grief, but also gratitude. It was mourning and renewal intertwined. Inside the palace, the king finally appeared at one of the tall windows overlooking the gates. He stood alone, not in ceremonial attire, but in quiet reflection. Those who saw him described a figure who no longer looked like the center of a system, but like a man standing inside a story that had outgrown him. He had made the decision that began this shift. But now the movement belonged to the people and to a legacy larger than any one person. The monarchy was still standing, but it was no longer standing in the same way. It was standing differently now, softer, less distant, more human. William and Catherine emerged once again, just as the sun began to break through the clouds. Their presence no longer surprised anyone. It felt expected, almost natural, as though they had become part of the landscape of this moment. When they stepped onto the palace steps, the crowd fell silent, not in forced reverence but in quiet trust. They did not need a stage or fanfare. Their presence alone was enough to anchor the day. This was what emotional leadership looked like. It was not about taking power. It was about carrying legacy with dignity. They walked slowly to the gates once more, stopping to read some of the new messages placed among the flowers. A child had left a handwritten note that said, "Thank you for remembering her." Catherine knelt down and touched the corner of the paper gently, her face soft and still. It was a small gesture, but one that rippled through the crowd. William placed his hand briefly on her shoulder, and though neither of them spoke, the message was clear. They were not just observing this moment, they were part of it. They belonged to it just as the people did. Analysts described this as a rare alignment of public feeling and royal symbolism. There were no grand decrees, no events arranged in advance, and yet this was becoming one of the most defining moments of the modern monarchy. It was a new chapter that did not begin with a coronation or a formal announcement, but with silence, flowers, and shared memory. It was not about replacing the past, but embracing it fully. It was about acknowledging what had been lost and allowing it to shape what comes next. In this quiet alignment, the monarchy was being redefined not from the top down, but from the ground up. The global response mirrored this sentiment. Newspapers, television networks, and digital platforms described the moment with words like reckoning, healing, and legacy reborn. Images of the blue brooches and white roses became visual shorthand for a story that was larger than any individual. Commentators pointed out how rare it was for an institution so old, so steeped in formality, to experience change not through official action but through emotional transformation. This was not forced. It was organic, and that made it powerful. The king's own silence became a form of acknowledgement. He did not issue another statement. He did not try to retake the center of the narrative. By simply watching, he allowed the story to breathe on its own. This act of stepping back was, in its own way, a quiet surrender to the inevitable. And in that surrender, the public found something they had been waiting for, not perfection, but humanity. For many, it was the first time they felt the institution, and the people were standing on the same ground. As night fell again, the palace gates remained surrounded by the soft glow of candles. The white roses now covered so much ground that it looked like the building was standing on a field of memory. In that glow, people began to speak less of scandal and more of future. They spoke of trust, of continuity, of a story that had come full circle. The image of Diana was no longer a shadow. It was the light guiding the way forward. William and Catherine stood once more at the gates, their silhouettes framed against the soft light spilling from the palace windows. They did not address the crowd. They did not need to. Their presence alone told the story that everyone had already come to understand. This was no longer about a single announcement, a single scandal, or even a single person. This was about the rewriting of a legacy that had lived in the hearts of millions. It had returned not as a whisper, but as the foundation of what would come next. This was the birth of a new chapter. It did not need trumpets or proclamations. It needed memory, emotion, and the quiet understanding that the people and the crown were finally looking in the same direction. The white roses and blue brooches would eventually be cleared away, but the moment would remain. It would live in the way people remembered this week, in the way they spoke about it years from now, in the way the monarchy would be understood going forward. A legacy once fractured had been gathered up and placed gently back where it belonged, at the very heart of the story.